Hello and welcome to the James Bond Countdown, the series where I, a lifelong 007 fan, bring you ranked lists pertaining to every last aspect of the James Bond film franchise. Today I am ranking my personal favorite tradition of the 007 movies, the pre-title sequence. I think if you were to take a poll of what Bond fans most look forward to seeing whenever a new movie comes out, the vast majority of them would say the pre-title sequence, myself included. The tradition of starting the movie with an edge-of-your-seat cliffhanger sequence is one that has inspired generations of moviegoers and filmmakers alike. Just ask Steven Spielberg, Tom Cruise, and Christopher Nolan. But like a great many cinematic precedents that this series has set, nobody does it better than Bond. On that note, so many of the films have done it so well that it makes it incredibly difficult to rank them amongst each other. In fact, this is probably the list that changes around more often than any other for me. And when I sat down to do this most recent ranking, I was actually surprised by how much my preferences have changed since even just a couple years ago. But before I dive in, I'm actually going to do something that I typically try to avoid in the interest of committing to my rankings. Honorable mentions. There's really not many lists I would do this for. I usually like to rank my top 10 or rank them all, but this was one instance where I wanted to keep it to 10 and just couldn't resist talking about a couple of others. Those others being License to Kill and No Time to Die. I really do like both of these sequences, but they're both hurt by the same thing in my opinion, which is that they're just too stop and go. They're both very ambitious in the number of characters and plot threads that they're trying to set up for the rest of the movie. But the consequence of that is the action never being able to sustain its momentum, which is a shame because they both feature some truly Bondian highlights that are among my favorite action moments in the series. And I'm not sure which one I'd give the edge to either. They pretty much even out for me, both falling just shy of the all-timers. Speaking of which, let's get on with the countdown, shall we? This is a top 10. Kicking off my list is none other than the all-around trendsetter that is Goldfinger. I think there are two directors most responsible for what the pre-title sequence ultimately became, and the first is Guy Hamilton. In his own words, his approach to this sequence was a lovely little bit of nonsense, which is his way of pitching the pre-title sequence as a teaser of tone rather than a setup of story. Don't bog it down with plot, you've got a whole movie for that. This can just be a fun, pulpy, one-off adventure that warmly welcomes you into the world of James Bond. And that is exactly what the opening of Goldfinger does. You pick up with Bond in the middle of a mission, and you've barely had time to breathe before he's emerged from the water, planted explosives, changed into a tuxedo, and lighted a cigarette while half the country explodes behind him. Where is he? Who is he bombing? Why is this beautiful woman double-crossing him? It doesn't matter. All that matters is you're on the edge of your seat by the time that title song blows you back in. On that note, the thing I appreciate most about this sequence is certainly the pace. Terrence Young was more of a slow burn kind of guy, so I love that Guy Hamilton came in guns blazing. And while the scale of this sequence has been outdone many times over, the establishment and execution of the pre-title formula is pitch perfect. The other director I consider to be most responsible for realizing the full potential of a pre-title sequence is the one and only Lewis Gilbert. And although he took his first shot with You Only Live Twice, it was his opening for The Spy Who Loved Me which took the pre-title sequence to new heights, figuratively and literally. The sheer scope and scale of this pre-title sequence is so much grander than any of the ones before it. It manages to set up the movie ahead of us whilst also delivering that mission-in-progress excitement in the spirit of Goldfinger. I particularly love how Bond's introduction in this film feels like it could easily be the end of a Bond movie, prompting us to think of all the in-between missions that we don't get to see. But of course, the big way that this opening informed pre-title sequences forevermore was the decision to showcase a signature stunt. For my money, the way that the ski jump is performed, shot, and edited makes it the most effective stunt not only in Bond history, but in movie history. It truly did set the standard for every single breathtaking, heart-stopping cinematic stunt that has come since. But setting aside how practically impressive it is, its execution in the context of the sequence is nothing short of magnificent. It's a moment that defines James Bond as a character. What does 007 do when he's outnumbered, outgunned, and reaching the edge of a cliff? He jumps off and boldly boasts a Union Jack parachute. I can think of no chase sequence with a better climax, particularly considering how seamlessly it transitions into the title sequence that follows. I actually used to rank this sequence a lot higher, but these days I just feel like the action takes a bit too long to kick in. The actual chase only occupies about 2 of the sequence's 8 minutes. That being said, I don't ever see this leaving my top 10. I think the opening of Octopussy is the one that really solidified the blueprint by which pre-title sequences are still structured to this day. The formula is firing on all cylinders. It immediately sets the stage for international espionage. Then we're introduced to Bond undercover, on a mission. He infiltrates the bad guy's headquarters and plants a bomb, a la Goldfinger. But then there's a complication, forcing him to improvise and figure out a new way to complete his objective. These are the quintessential beats of a pre-title sequence, ones that have been echoed in virtually every Bond opening since. You feel shades of it in the openings of Dalton, Brosnan, and Craig. The other key success of this sequence is that it clocks in at just the right length. Not too short, not too long, and on the flip side of that coin, it's perfectly paced. Not too fast, not too slow. I also think that the action of this sequence holds up really well for the most part. Yeah, you can kind of tell that most of Roger's inserts are just the plain stationary with the camera moving around it, but there are also some beautifully executed effects shots. All in all, I think we have a lot to thank this sequence for. It paved the way for pretty much all of the other sequences on this list. I'm just going to come right out and say it. Pierce Brosnan has hands down the strongest pre-title track record of any of the Bond actors. He is 4 for 4, every single one absolutely knocking it out of the park. In the case of Tomorrow Never Dies, we are given a pitch-perfect delivery of the aforementioned Octopussy formula. Bond is out in the field, man on a mission, and forced to improvise, leading to the kind of world-saving narrow escape that only James Bond can deliver. There's a lot of things I love about this sequence, from Brosnan's introduction to M's passionate support of her man doing his job, and certainly David Arnold's rousing score. The build-up of Bond getting that plane off the runway just as the missile strikes has my heart racing every time. It's just such a masterful way of using the Bond theme to elevate the action, and it's the sort of thing that really makes me miss David Arnold's contributions to this series. I also love that this sequence still manages to be a one-off adventure even though they're setting up the main plot with the encoder. However, if there's a reason this sequence doesn't rank any higher for me, it's because it does feel a little paint by numbers, which is of course the same way I feel about Tomorrow Never Dies as a whole. That being said, paint by numbers could just be another way of saying it's doing everything right. Whatever you want to call it, there's no denying that this pre-title sequence is an exhilarating all-timer. Timothy Dalton's explosive entry into the world of James Bond has always been one of my favorite pre-title sequences. The opening moments of The Living Daylights are once again an impeccable execution of the pre-title formula. This sequence actually only has a slight edge on the Tomorrow Never Dies opening for me, and that's because of the way that it informs who Dalton's Bond is going to be, which is perhaps its most important job as his first pre-title sequence. Yes, obviously Dalton's introductory shot is amazing in and of itself, but the sequence as a whole really defines him as a no-nonsense Bond who's going to get the job done. I always love it when the series acknowledges other 00 agents, so naturally I love the premise of introducing Bond alongside a couple of his colleagues during a training exercise. And the way that it's shot is so simple, yet so brilliant, keeping you guessing as to which one of these guys is Bond, of course only revealing him last, and only at the moment when things go wrong. Which brings us back to how this sequence defines Dalton's Bond. He wastes absolutely no time leaping into action. He doesn't even get a chance to process the death of his fellow agent before he's on the roof of the killer's getaway vehicle. And that sets the stage for some really superb stunt work, some of which is performed by Dalton himself. There are still some noticeable rear projection shots, but while they may be noticeable, I don't find them as distracting as some of the older ones in the series, especially because they're interspersed with shots of Dalton actually riding on top of the Jeep. The action of this sequence has a really nice evolution to it too. Bond slowly gaining the upper hand as the Jeep makes its way down the mountain. First he's on top, struggling to hold on, then he's halfway in, wrestling for the steering wheel, then he's all the way in, fighting with the driver, and finally he makes the sort of escape that only James Bond can, parachuting out the back of the free-falling Jeep just before it explodes into a million pieces. But it's the final moment on the yacht that really puts a punctuation mark on both Dalton's depiction of Bond and the sequence as a whole. He lands almost literally right on top of a beautiful woman, but he doesn't drop a cheeky one-liner or even give her a second look. He snatches her phone, spits out his classic introduction with total ownership of the words, and reports to MI6. Then just when you think this pre-title sequence might conclude rather anticlimactically, the filmmakers offer a final tongue-in-cheek moment of levity to let us know that this is still James Bond, and Bond is back. I don't blame you if you're shocked that this opening didn't land higher on my list. I was shocked too, because for a great many years, I cited The World Is Not Enough as my all-time favorite pre-title sequence. I actually think that quite a lot of Bond fans do, and it's easy to see why. The Thames chase pulls out all the stops to become one of the greatest action stunt sequences in the whole franchise. Add on to that Brosnan's peak performance as James Bond. He does so much to make you feel the danger of this sequence. Every twist and turn has such an urgency about it, and you really buy him as the top agent that Bond is meant to be. He's just so damn efficient. But upon revisiting it, I found this sequence a little bit handicapped by its unconventional structure. Anyone familiar with the making of this movie will undoubtedly know that this sequence was originally supposed to end after the Bilbao meeting, with the MI6 scene as the first thing after the credits, which makes a lot of sense because the M's office briefing is traditionally the first thing we would expect to see after the opening title sequence. And while I think they definitely made the right call considering how underwhelming it would have been to end after the Bilbo meeting, I also think the extended sequence almost starts to enter that stop-and-go territory of my honorable mentions. When we get to M's office, it kind of feels like the movie has properly started, almost like we've just missed or skipped the title sequence. But if the first half of this opening leaves something to be desired, then the second half surely delivers it. And it is the sheer excellence of that second half that will always keep this pre-title sequence in my top 10. As much as I love the bombastic stylings of a traditional pre-title sequence, I'm also not opposed to a bold subversion of that formula, especially if it's done as brilliantly as the opening of Casino Royale. No Bond film has ever been more justified in changing things up than this one. It is Bond Begins, so it's only fitting that the pre-title sequence would show us how Bond earns his 00 status, which is frankly something that probably never even occurred to most casual viewers, or even most Bond fans, save for those who read the books. I love that a 00 is quite literally a mark of having carried out 2 assassinations. But what's even more admirable is the choice to make those kills so intimate. The easy thing would have been to stage a traditional Bondian action set piece as the backdrop for those kills, but the filmmakers showed tremendous restraint by giving us a back-to-basics spy scene that could have been lifted straight from Fleming. And not only is it a beautiful ode to Fleming, but it's also a wonderful throwback to the "You've Had Your Six" scene from Dr. No. What better way to sell us on a new Bond than to remind us of the cold, ruthless, and even morbid hero that these films started with? On that note, I can't praise Craig enough here. He's so calm and methodical in the conversation with Dryden, yet so brutal and vulnerable in the fight with Fisher. It's nothing short of chef's kiss. I also love the subtle nuances of this scene, such as flying past a photo of Dryden and his family as Bond shoots him. It suggests that Bond's job, unlike this sequence, is not black and white. The men he kills have wives and children, innocent people who will suffer as a result of Bond doing his job. All in all, this is hands down the most thoughtfully constructed pre-title sequence in the whole franchise. The moment you see that first black and white frame, you know you're in for something special. I would even argue this sequence is not just distinctly different from other Bond films, but from anything else in Casino Royale. The unsettling Dutch angles, the cloak and dagger dialogue, David Arnold's moody noir-inspired score. It's also unique within Bond's cinematic catalog, and I doubt we'll ever see anything quite like it again. I'll be honest, I really surprised myself with this one. I still can't believe how high the Die Another Day pre-title sequence has climbed on my list. There was a time when the most I would have given this opening is an honorable mention, and looking back, I don't know how I ever could have convinced myself that this doesn't belong in the top 10, let alone the top 5. Does it feature some of that same campy excess that the rest of the movie suffers from? Sure, but I would argue that it feels appropriate in the pre-title sequence. Thinking about the franchise circa 2002, it felt like the natural, logical evolution of the series at that point in time, a culmination of everything the cinematic James Bond had become. It ticks all the boxes of the classic pre-title formula and delivers them on a larger scale than I think they'd ever been done before. In fact, I think this opening evokes the feeling of a James Bond movie more quickly than almost any other pre-title sequence. You're sucked straight into it with the sweeping shots of Bond and his fellow agents surfing onto the shore as David Arnold's truly epic score swells with each wave. Speaking of which, I think the overall score of this opening might just be the best of any pre-title sequence. It's neck and neck with the one for Skyfall. But back to the opening itself. I love how quintessential it feels in its depiction of Bond. You've got the serious, focused man on a mission, a little bit of cheeky levity, some undercover spy work, and finally the classic action hero. And all of it is played to absolute perfection by the man Pierce Brosnan. He's cool, he's confident, and he kicks ass. I also just love the premise of this sequence. It's not unusual for Bond's pre-title mission to go awry, but making that a result of a mole inside MI6 selling him out was such an exciting choice. Colonel Moon might be a little bit of a ham, but not nearly as much as he is once he turns into Gustav Graves. And before I move on, I have to compliment the action of this sequence. Say what you will about Lee Tamahori, but he directed some of the best action of Brosnan's tenure. The tension he builds in the moments leading up to all hell breaking loose is nothing short of masterful. Just the same, the way he releases that tension with the watch-triggered blast is truly a signature Bond moment. And then you have the hovercraft chase, which remains one of my personal favorite depictions of Bond improvising in the heat of the moment, creating as much chaos as possible, dropping the gate at the last second, blowing up the mines, using his environment to fight Moon, and finally grabbing hold of the bell to escape the crash. And all of it shot and edited with such a kinetic energy. I may have been surprised that this pre-title sequence had climbed so high on my list, but in the future I'll be surprised if it doesn't climb even higher. I previously mentioned how the most important job of an actor's first pre-title sequence is to inform who their Bond is going to be. And the opening of GoldenEye very quickly tells us that Pierce Brosnan's 007 is going to be the ultimate amalgamation of all the Bonds who came before him. An homage to the danger of Sean Connery and the wit of Roger Moore set against the backdrop of a new millennium. But as much as I enjoy the way that it introduces Brosnan, the real brilliance of this sequence for me is just how many seeds it plants without the audience even realizing it. On the surface, it's just your standard mission in progress formula where something goes wrong and Bond has to escape. But look at what happens along the way. First, you've got the most obvious one, the relationship between James Bond and Alec Trevelyan. In the mere 3 minutes that we get to see them together, we are totally invested in their brotherhood, thus priming us to be invested in the betrayal that comes later. But then there's more subtle things, like the rather cold-blooded shot of Alec murdering an innocent lab worker to suggest something ruthless festering beneath the surface, or Bond changing the minutes on the timers, and of course Alec's "for England" sentiment. And all of it is subliminal. A lesser film would have highlighted these moments in bold letters, but GoldenEye hides them in the subtext, and when they come back around for a payoff later in the movie, you suddenly see everything that you didn't even realize you noticed. What's even more amazing is that these elements of the sequence are so excellent that I haven't even mentioned the bungee jump yet, a stunt that almost rivals the Spy Who Loved Me ski jump. Almost. I think the edit hurts it by cutting out to the wide angle in the middle of the free fall. I totally get the temptation to show off all your angles, but I think it would have been more effective to play the whole stunt in one continuous shot. That being said, this moment is still so authentically Bondian, as is the other big stunt of this sequence, the bike jump after the plane. I've heard some people complain about the composite shots of Brosnan, but I actually think they hold up really well, particularly the one where he enters the plane. I really could just go on and on singing the praises of this pre-title sequence. The scope, the stunts, the construction, the characterization, all of it is written, directed, shot, edited, and acted to a gold standard. For me, the opening of Skyfall represents the modern pre-title sequence realized to its fullest potential. An action-packed 10 to 12-minute teaser shot on location and driven by large-scale practical filmmaking. This is the sort of sequence that the Bond franchise needs if it's ever going to compete with the likes of Tom Cruise and Christopher Nolan. Make no mistake, there are so many amazing pre-title sequences, but this one just hits different. And I think it might come down to the staging and cinematography. It's very common for action sequences to be delegated to a second unit, and for a lot of Bond films, I think that kind of resulted in the action equivalent of insert shots. It's all very efficiently done so you know where everyone is and what's going on, but it's shot kind of flat. It's not all that visually dynamic. There have, of course, been exceptions over the years, like when a director such as Martin Campbell steps in, but I think the person who really makes a difference in this opening is cinematographer Roger Deakins. The way he shot this sequence just feels so epic. Close-ups have an urgency, wide shots have a vastness, and there's just such a wealth of movement in every frame. Combine that with a real Russian doll of a chase sequence and you've got the ultimate escapist action spectacle. But it's not just the craft of the filmmaking that I love about this pre-title sequence, it's also the characterization of Bond. Similar to Brosnan in World Is Not Enough, Craig really sells the efficiency of James Bond in his prime during this sequence. Speaking of which, this opening is really the only time we ever got to see Craig play Bond in his prime. He was a rookie agent earning his stripes in the first 2 movies, then at the top of his game here, but then for the rest of Skyfall and both movies after it, he's a weathered veteran agent with everyone making wisecracks about his knees. And as much as I enjoyed most of the Craig era, I do think it's a shame that it essentially skipped over Bond's best years, just doing his duty, going on missions in the classic fashion. But I digress. In short, Skyfall is my #1 favorite pre-title sequence because it's got the classic straight into the action formula supported by sweeping, immersive filmmaking and a great actor playing a great Bond at the height of his powers. Well, there you have it, my top 10 favorite pre-title sequences. Please do jump down into the comments and share your personal favorites. I'm sure every Bond fan has their own criteria for what they want out of a pre-title sequence, and I'd love to know yours. As always, don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss a countdown.